Welcome to our video on self-regulation, self-presentation, and a self-esteem application. So what we're going to look at now is a very important concept that's related to self-perception, but it's related not only to that, this concept of self-regulation is so important to so many areas of our lives, including relationships, how well we do at work, how well we do in school. And as we look at self-regulation, think about how important self-regulation has been for you. If you are very good at self-regulating, if you're a person who struggles with this, think about how you might have an opportunity to improve by increasing those self-regulation skills. And think about, as you learn about self-regulation, how does this develop? And what factors might deplete self-regulation? What makes it difficult for you to control your impulses? So what are you going to learn? You're going to learn what self-regulation is. And you're also going to learn about something called the ego depletion model of self-regulation. You're also going to be learning about how self-efficacy develops and why it's important to psychological adjustment. And then you're also going to be learning about some important categories of self-defeating behavior. So let's get started. What is self-regulation? I think probably many of you have a general idea. Some of you may have a very specific definition in mind, and it doesn't have to be exactly what you see here. Again, the definitions that I have here or that you get in your textbook, and sometimes I'll have the ones that are from your textbook in quotations, those are just the way that one person or an author or the way that I might describe a concept. But we all have different ways of describing things using different words. And what we see with self-regulation is that, it's the general overall process of directing and controlling our behavior. And research consistently shows that self-regulation is necessary for our sense of emotional well-being. And so we really can think about self-regulation as an ability to not only direct and control our behavior, but really we're talking about doing so in a way that's in our best long-term interest and that's consistent with our deepest values. And so this is because when we violate those deep values that we have, this can cause some feelings of guilt and shame and anxiety, which then can undermine our well-being. And so, for example, emotionally, self-regulation would be if your friend upsets you and you may feel like you want to say something to let them know, and maybe you're really angry at them, and you may feel very angry, and you your immediate inclination is to say something that might be hurtful to them. And self-regulation, though, is the ability to calm yourself down when you're upset, and then also to cheer yourself up when you're down. I want to give you a very simple example. My son, I have twins. I've mentioned this before. He's 8 years old. He is a child that he experiences emotions very intensely. He's a very sensitive kid. So when he's happy, he's really intensely happy and excited. And when he's upset, he's really intensely upset. And sometimes, like any kid and some adults, he might say things that he doesn't mean. And so what we're working on is some strategies to help him we've been doing this for quite a while, for him to calm himself down and to not say things that he doesn't want to say. And so just for example, last night, his twin brother upset him. And I was downstairs, I could hear them up in their bedroom. And I heard his brother, and his brother was really irritating. He was really annoying him, like sometimes brothers will do. And then I heard my son say, "I'm leaving, I need a break." And I thought that is so great, because we talked about that being one strategy, that when someone's upsetting you or when you're mad about something, you need to walk away. That can be a great step. We might say things like count to 10. I don't know if it was Thomas Jefferson, I can't remember. It's someone, I think it might have been him, who said, when you're angry, count to 10. When you're really angry, count to 100. Sometimes that can be hard to do, especially for a kid when they're in the presence of the person making them mad, like his twin brother. So when I heard him say that, he was demonstrating self-regulation. And you can think about automatic versus controlled processing here. His default may be, and it's not so much now, but let's imagine his default was to get mad back at his brother. And but his this controlled processing, that's what he was doing. And if we can practice that and he can be doing this regularly, then I think he will grow a lot. So I'm just thinking about this because my son, he does have a lot of self-discipline, I think in many regards, and he likes to stick to what he plans on doing, what he thinks. So um, my son, for example, now we are in the season. This is springtime and it's Lent. It's within the period 40 days before Easter. And he initially thought he was going to give up candy for Lent. And he decided, we talked about it, he was going to give up saying mean things because when he gets mad. And that's hard for a lot of adults. And so he has been doing amazingly with this. And I think it's because he has that additional commitment. It's not just to me and his dad or to his brother. He really wants to stick with this. And so I'm very proud of him. And I'm hoping that after 40 days of this, it's going to move from controlled processing to automatic processing. So think about things you could do for yourself that might improve self-regulation. What do you do that might not be the best response that could negatively be affecting maybe relationships, maybe your health, maybe when you're upset, you tend to overeat. We talked about that in the last module. So that is another example of not being self-regulated. So you're not dealing with that emotion in the most healthy way. I think it's so important for us when we think about self-regulation is we need to think about the biology and the function of emotions in general and specifically related to feelings. So emotions that we have, they move us. The word emotion actually is derived from the Latin that literally means to move. And the ancients, they believed that emotions move behavior, and they really do. We used to have a course here called Motivation and Emotion. We haven't offered it for a while. It was part of our required curriculum, and that's since changed because of we've really made things more consistent across the state. But it made sense that the course was called Motivation and Emotion. Are we really motivated without emotion? What if you had no emotions? Would you be motivated? No, probably not. So in modern times, when we think about emotions, instead of saying that they move behavior, we say that they motivate behavior. And what they're doing is they're energizing us to do things by sending chemical signals to muscles and organs of the body, and then they're preparing us for action. So in the case of my son getting very upset with his brother, and his brother was just aggravating him a lot, what's happening is he's getting in that fight or flight mode, which can make it even harder for us to regulate our emotions because our primitive brain, the limbic system, is going to be very active. And that prefrontal cortex, which for children is not even close to being fully developed. For adults, not developed till we're about 25 years of age fully. And so it can be hard to regulate emotions and be great at it. It takes a lot of practice developing this when we're in fight or flight mode. And so whether subtle or intense or maybe the conscious or unconscious, all emotions really have three different motivations. I think we can think of them as approaching, avoiding, or attacking. And so if we're approaching something, we want to get more of something, right? We want to discover more. We want to appreciate more. You increase its value or its worthiness with your attention. And so we might, think of these approach emotions as interest. We're interested in something. We enjoy something. We love something. And so some of the behaviors might be learning or encouraging, negotiating, or cooperating, all the things that we like, right? And then avoid, we want to get away from it. And so those would include things like withdrawing, maybe looking down or dismissing. And then attack, we want to devalue, maybe even insult. We don't want to do that, but that might be our primitive sort of mode that we're in. Criticize, harm. dominate. So the attack emotions are anger and contempt. I think that's, and I'm sure my son would love that I'm sharing this with you, but that was what he was feeling. He was really mad at his brother. And so he could have responded by saying mean things, or even, he could try to hit his brother, right? And so those are those attack behaviors. So I'm getting to where this then relates to self-regulation. So we have these different emotions, and when we act on these basic motivations of emotions, we're not really paying attention to our feelings. We're just acting. So maybe, we get interested in something and we notice that several hours have passed and we weren't really aware of how we feel. Or um, maybe we we're not paying attention to someone that we care about. Or maybe our family member or friend tells us that we hurt their feelings and we're totally unaware of that. So we were just acting and not thinking about our own feelings and what we were doing. So if you can become aware of your own feelings, this is where self-regulation comes in. When you're aware of the feelings, if you reflect on them, then that will often stop the motivation and then change the behavior. And it can also distort the feeling. So for example, let's say that you're angry at someone. I'm going to use that as an example because I think the self-regulation emotions that can be really damaging in relationships are those ones that are involving those, anger and being very upset because of the behaviors that then result from them. So let's say that, your family member, your friend has said something to you and you feel really bad, so you stop and you become aware of those feelings. How is your body feeling? What is going through your mind? The more that you can think about what that emotion is and what is going on in your body, it can actually help you to sort of reduce the intensity of those emotions and control yourself. So self-regulation is more attainable when you focus on, when you're really objective in how you think about what you're feeling, and you focus on also at the same time your values. Yes, I'm angry, but do I really want to be that person? So you're challenging yourself. You're focusing on your values. So you're really getting a signal about reality. And by the way, when we focus on our feelings, we don't want to really, focus on, oh, that person's making me angry. That's why I'm feeling that way, because then that's going to stimulate even more anger. And then if you focus on yourself and say, oh, I just tend to get angry, then that, of course, can lead to some feelings of depression. So I think if we can think about our values and just challenge them and realize this is my body in attack mode, but this is not who I want to be. And so you're not moving then in either of those unhealthy paths, then we can be much better at self-regulating. Now, we're only good at self-regulating for so long, especially if we've had to self-regulate for a long time. I think of, for example, here's an example. This one's from your textbook. Let's say you successfully resist temptation to indulge yourself with sweets today, then it becomes more difficult to do so tomorrow. Or maybe at work you have, I know in our department before coronavirus, we would have these every so often, like during holidays, everyone would bring in nice food, and it was usually things that aren't so healthy, but really delicious food. And perhaps, you're thinking to yourself, I know I have, oh, I probably shouldn't eat so much, but then I would really enjoy what I was eating. So what would this model say if, let's say that I'm really trying to regulate what I'm eating because I'm trying to be very controlled. And then later, let's say that um, we are in a meeting and someone says something that's very rude or unkind. And is it going to be harder for me to self-regulate than it would have been if I didn't have to self-regulate just a little while ago? It absolutely is. Probably many of you have noticed this in yourself. I know I have. I try really hard to model in myself what I want to see in my kids was self-regulation. So, and I'm also very affected by lots of things going on around me. I'm very sensitive to stimulation in my environment, and I have 3 young kids. So, it takes a lot of energy sometimes to not get aggravated and to not have that, to be, express that I'm overwhelmed. And it's over years, I've really worked on this. Probably before I had kids, I don't think I could have been like I am now. It's taken time for me to be able to really keep that, very calm and consistently, kind of focused on my values, demeanor. So I do this for a while and I'm really controlled and I'm doing really well. And then suddenly, it's just gone on for too long and I just feel so overwhelmed. Well, I know when I'm starting to feel that way, I need to just go and spend some time by myself. I need a little break because I know that I might raise my voice and I don't want to be a yeller. I don't want to be the parent who's yelling at my kids. Of course, I'm not suggesting I've never raised my voice, but I really don't want to do that. I want them to learn themselves how to control their own emotions. And then I know how that can be so negatively affect relationships. And it's not good for me either. So I know that when I'm starting to feel that way, I have to, and I'll tell my husband, I'll say, I'm just going to go outside and sit on the steps. What was really cool is that last year, when my daughter was in childcare, she was in daycare or her school. Her one of her friends had come up to her and was annoying her. My daughter at the time was 2, maybe just turned, maybe yeah, she was 2, I think. And her friend had taken a little like a little snake, a plastic snake, and put it around my daughter's right near her neck. They were playing outside, and my daughter just walked away. And then her friend followed her and continued to do it. And this was her really good friend. And then my daughter said, I need to go sit over here and read a book. And so at first it didn't hit me until when her teacher told me this, and then it suddenly did. I thought, oh my goodness, this is what I tell my kids, that I'm just going to go outside. I'm going to read for a few minutes. And so I'll just take a book, sit out on the front porch. My daughter or son or whoever might sit next to me. But she was modeling that behavior. So we can learn self-regulation through modeling. I didn't even realize I was doing that. Kids pick up on everything. But self-regulation overall is such an important skill, and we all need to work on that. And I think it's a lifelong process. Self-efficacy is also an important part of our self-perception, how we see ourselves. And so self-efficacy is the belief that we have in our abilities to perform certain behaviors that should lead to certain outcomes. And self-efficacy is very important to healthy adjustment. Now, fortunately, if you don't have very high self-efficacy, if you don't think you're very good at something, this can be changed. So we can learn and then change our self-efficacy. And so this is such a great thing because in adjustment, if we think about our own mental health, increasing self-efficacy is so important to our physical and our mental health. So how do we develop self-efficacy? Since it's important for us to know how we develop it. This is important and valuable for yourself. And then also if we think about how we can help others to develop a sense of self-efficacy. For those of you going into a helping profession, I think it's very valuable for you to know about the importance of self-efficacy and how one could help clients to develop that sense that they are good at doing certain things. So how do we do it? Well, we can develop it in a variety of ways. One is through mastery experiences, and this is where we learn new skills. And when we learn new skills, we learn to do something and we end up eventually developing an ability to be good at it. This can increase our sense of self-efficacy. So let's say that, you have a person who's feeling like maybe a client and they're not feeling like they're very good at some of the maybe they don't feel like they're very good at their job. Okay, so maybe they've had some struggles at work. If we want to increase their self-efficacy, we could help them by identifying some ways to change some of their behaviors or ways of thinking about things at work. But we might also help them by helping them to think about some new skills that they could learn, some new things that they could try, that new things that they might enjoy. So For example, maybe your client enjoys riding bikes. So what about learning to mountain bike? So that's not a huge step away from riding bikes, and you can gradually move from very beginner trails to more advanced trails. So you're helping them to identify opportunities to develop those skills. I think about, with kids, I think this is so important, especially because we know kids, yes, they all develop, they mature biologically in a certain pattern. So we tend to see certain things happening or unfolding, but it doesn't happen at the same time for every kid. So you have kids in a classroom who are often at different levels and different places in their abilities. And that does not mean that the child who's maybe not where their peers are with a certain skill is not going to get there. They just may be developmentally at a different place, and they will get there. But if they're feeling, as though they're not doing as well as their peers, this is where it's an opportunity then for parents to identify alternative opportunities for that child to develop a sense of self-efficacy. So, I think, for example, kids being involved in sports can be so beneficial, so helpful. So, like think about, for example, if you have a child, or maybe you're working with children, what are some things that that child might enjoy getting involved in? Would they like soccer? Would they like baseball? Would they like, I know my kids, they play soccer, and I think that's very helpful for their sense of self-efficacy. And they've recently started parkour, which is kind of like the Ninja Warrior stuff, I guess you could say, mixed with gymnastics. And I love that they're fine, that they are developing skills, and they're still learning parkour. But as they do, imagine that sense of self-efficacy that they're building as they master new tasks. And good teachers, which they have, are helping them to do that. They're helping them to master new skills. And so they're building that sense of, hey, I am good at these behaviors or these outcomes. And then we also have vicarious experiences. And if we watch other people learn a new skill, this can help us to develop a sense of self-efficacy. So for those of you who like to maybe watch the cooking channel, or you like to watch any cooking shows, maybe you weren't feeling so great about your own cooking abilities, but as you've watched some of these cooking shows, you say, hey, I could do that. I know for myself, I love cooking shows, and I've watched them for years, and now I like to watch cooking shows and just get some ideas and then sort of make my own thing. Where I used to be more focused on recipes. So I kind of take those things that I'm learning and just move them into my own recipes. And so I'm doing that. I'm developing a sense of self-efficacy, not just by in my mind thinking about these things on my own. I've learned this through vicarious experiences, watching other people. And then persuasion and encouragement. So other people telling someone that they are good at something, or hey, I know you can do this. Or, I noticed you were really good when you were mountain biking. You did a great job. Would you teach me that sometime? Or for example, with cooking, you cook a great meal and your family says, wow, this is really delicious. And that contributes to a sense of self-efficacy. And then also interpretation of emotional arousal. And so we need to remind ourselves that when we try new things, it is extremely natural to feel nervous. Everyone does. I know that when children, for example, because a lot of these, these emotions that they're feeling and experiences that they're having are so new, it's so helpful with kids to remind them, hey, when I was a kid, I felt that way too. Or, when people are trying new things, this is very normal for them to feel this way. Did you notice that your heart rate was going up and you kind of were getting a little bit forgetful? Well, that happens to everybody. So reminding kids, reminding yourself, really recognizing that that's very normal. And so that we recognize it's normal, then we don't attribute it to fear, which then can result in a sort of escalation where things move into a direction where we may feel even more intense fear, which can lead to avoidance. Let's now spend a little bit of time looking at self-defeating behaviors. So have you ever realized that one of your behaviors was causing you harm? Probably never happened to any of you, right? I think it's probably happened to all of us where we realize, hey, I should not be doing that. I should not be eating so much ice cream, or I should not be so argumentative, or I shouldn't be watching so much TV. I should probably be exercising more. Whatever those things are that you have had come across your mind, I think those are some pretty common ones that perhaps you may have thought about before. And these are self-defeating behaviors, and they're seemingly intentional actions that negatively or thwart our self-interest. And they come in three different categories. We have deliberate self-destruction. So it might, this is something where we're intentionally sabotaging ourselves. And then we have trade-offs where we're engaging in short-term, maybe harmful behaviors to pursue healthy long-term goals. And then we have counterproductive strategies. And this is where we persist in ineffective strategies to achieve a goal. So why do we do these things? Well, self-destructive behaviors, generally, if we think about each of these, they provide sometimes pleasure or even relief in the short term. But then, of course, they get in the way of living the life that feels ultimately satisfying and where we feel fulfilled. I think some examples of some very just self-destructive behaviors outside of those that are very within what's more typical would be like alcohol and drug abuse, binge eating, maybe like gambling. And then I think too, chronic avoidance. Some of you may have done that before where, you keep avoiding doing something. And, this is because it feels good in the short term. You're avoiding that, that bad feeling. But in the long term, it's not so good for you. Now, your book doesn't go into this much, but I think it's interesting often to think about why do we do these things outside of just the very obvious that it feels good in the short term, even though we know it's not so good in the long term. It turns out that, of course, there are lots of different reasons for why we might do this, but there are some of us, some people who are more prone to doing these things more frequently. So first of all, for people who tend to do this, they do tend to feel emotions more strongly than other people. And this is not a negative fact. Actually, I think having an intense feeling of being, when you're very happy or when someone hurts your feelings and you really feel that, there is a lot of good in having that emotional richness. But then there can also be the bad side of it, and because of how those bad emotions can feel so intense. And often people who are very and feel emotions very intensely, they are more likely to be creative and empathetic. But if people have, as adults, so we can biologically be wired to feel things more intensely. Like I mentioned, my son, Sebastian, he does feel things more intensely. He feels everything more intensely. He's more affected by music. I remember when he was just one and he would I remember him listening to classical music or watching something on PBS, and he had tears in his eyes and he actually had tears coming down his face as he was watching that. And it wasn't because he was upset. He feels things so much more. If certain flavors and smells and sounds. And some of you may have been like that when you were young. Your family members, your caregivers may have told you that. Now, as you move into adulthood, you may have you may have had some experiences where maybe it was really adverse. Maybe there was some neglect, or where maybe there was a lot of criticism, or maybe you had family members who discouraged the expression of emotions, or maybe you had a family member a significant caregiver who tended to also use self-destructive behaviors or engage in those, or maybe feeling excluded routinely as a kid. And so then, if you were born with the tendency to feel emotions strongly, and then add that you also may have had those experiences that were really intense, or even just that by itself, I think having intense adverse experiences can make you a little bit more susceptible to wanting to turn off the pain. So At first you may have, when you were feeling these things as a kid, I just don't want to feel this, or I'm not going to think about it. But then as those emotions became more intense, maybe you may have needed some additional things to help you to turn off those feelings. And so maybe that caused you to engage in self-defeating behaviors. And so in the short term, you've turned off those negative emotions, but then you're not really learning how to handle negative emotions. And what you're doing, it's like, I think you could equate it to putting an airtight lid on a pot of boiling water. It's not like that boiling water is going to go away. Yes, for a moment, you're not going to see the boiling water, but it's still there. The emotions are still there. And so they just keep building, like the pressure that's building in that covered pot. And so as that pressure keeps building, they can feel it gets more and more intense and basically unbearable. And then you may find ways then of trying to get rid of that pressure, that those uncomfortable behavior or those uncomfortable feelings. And so then it might lead you to engage in some self-defeating behaviors, especially when we think about those that are really destructive. As we think about the self, we often, I think, can't help but think about self presentation. And I think today, more than ever, many people are very cognizant of how they're coming across to others, especially in social media. So, what are you going to be learning now? You're going to learn about impression management, and then you're going to learn about some of the strategies that people use to make positive impressions. And you're also going to learn about what are called high self monitors and how these people are different from low self monitors. And I'd encourage you to think about yourself. Are you a high self monitor, or are you more of a low self monitor as we look at these concepts? So first, what is a public self? Well, this is an image that we present to others in social interactions. And today, social interactions are not just face to face, they're also online. As a matter of fact, of course, for many people, that public self, that presentation is very dominant online, more so than it is in the real world. The other day, I was driving home from the grocery store and I looked in my rearview mirror and I could see a guy while he was driving, he had his phone right above his face at just the right angle, and he was making faces in the into the phone. He was clearly taking a recording of himself, not a photograph, but a video, and he was singing into the image or into the camera, and he was doing so with his like these very very intentional ways of showing his face. So he wanted to come across in a certain way. And I got this all within like a span of just a few seconds. And this was pretty dangerous because the cars were moving. He was right behind me and I was looking back in my rearview mirror and could see him. And then I thought, oh, he's going to see me looking at him. But he never did. He was so absorbed in what he was doing. And of course, he was going to post that on social media. So he was presenting himself in in that online forum in whatever way, whatever place he was going to be posting it. These are social interactions where he's trying to present that public self. And public selves, of course, can vary. And I think this is another great place to think about social media, because social media is a place where often people's public self does not at all align with their public self in other places. So, I think about this guy, for example. Does he come across that way in all situations? Maybe he does, but maybe he doesn't. Or think about the friend who always presents themselves in a very positive light, as though everything is great and wonderful in their life, and all the images that they take of themselves only remotely look like them because they've taken it from a certain angle with a certain filter. They want to present this particular image. So what we have is we have multiple public selves. Now, these public selves can be in the workplace, they could be at school, they could be on social media, they could be with your parents. The thing is that when we have a lot of different public selves and they don't overlap, and there's a lot of disparity between them, this actually is not healthy for our personal adjustment. It's much healthier for us to have a consistent, or at least somewhat consistent. We can't always be the same person in every situation. There are different expectations, but pretty much some overlap in each of these different domains. That's going to lead to the healthiest level of adjustment. And if you look here in your textbook, this is an image that really demonstrates the importance of public selves and adjustment. Here you can see that person one has very divergent public selves with very little overlap among them. And then the second person has public selves that are more congruent with each other, and they're likely to be better adjusted. When I look at this image, I think about probably more important things than social media. I think about someone who has felt that and has experienced discrimination because of their sexual orientation. And so perhaps they feel that they can't be their true self in different environments. Maybe there's just a couple of environments where they can be their true self, but perhaps they don't feel like they can be with their parents or with their neighbors. And so think about how that could affect adjustment. Remember, the more congruent, the more integrated our public selves are, the better our adjustment is. As we think about the concept of the self, we also may think about how we intentionally want to affect how other people perceive us. And this is impression management. So these are the usually conscious efforts that we use to influence how other people think about us. And there are some specific strategies that we might use that include ingratiation, self-promotion, supplication, and negative acknowledgement. Let's start with ingratiation. This is where we behave in ways to make ourselves likable to others. And ingratiation can be planned, but it can also be used in just everyday encounters. So we're not necessarily planning ahead of time. It's just something that off the cuff we may think about doing. So an example of ingratiation being planned might be, let's say that you're wanting a raise at work, and so you invite your boss over for dinner. In an everyday social encounter, you might, you're trying to do something like maybe you hold the door for a classmate, thinking that that will make you more well-liked, or maybe you'll be seen in a more favorable way. Or maybe you are, immediately being very helpful to, maybe there's an older lady who is trying to put groceries in the car, and you're dating someone new, and you help them put the groceries in the car. You help the older lady do this. And so you're trying to make yourself more liked. Now, it doesn't mean that that's the reason you did that. But if that's the reason you did it, then that's called ingratiation. And then we have what's called self-promotion. With self-promotion, what you're trying to do is trying to present yourself to other people as capable, smart, or accomplished, or skilled. And this might be done through face-to-face conversations. So you're talking with someone in class or someone where you work. Maybe you do it on social media. Maybe you have a blog, or maybe you're giving a public speech or a presentation. You might even do this through you're doing it through maybe your posture, how you stand, how you speak, how you dress. And it really has it's kind of a natural approach that we may each take. And it's one that we might not be thinking about as we're doing it, but we each tend to want to be perceived favorably. That's actually within our biology. It's adaptive for us to want to do this. And so as we want to come across then in a positive way, we may do these things. We adjust our behavior. We adjust how we appear. And oftentimes this can be something that we have to do, because maybe if we don't do it, then we're not going to, for example, get a job that we're applying for. So, maybe you're applying for a job and there's 20 other people who are applying. And so you add some things to your resume. Now, I'm not suggesting being dishonest, but maybe you add some things you hadn't thought about that before that really make yourself sound good. You're highlighting those very positive qualities that you want other people to see in you. Another example of impression management is supplication. And so rather than trying to look able or strong or smart, people use supplication to purposely emphasize perhaps their weakness or even incompetence. So they're wanting to appear helpless. And the purpose is to advertise dependence on other people to then gain the sympathy of others. So for example, let's say that a child, maybe you all did this when you were a child at one point or another, or someone who did. You might act like you're not able to do something in order to get let's say you're not able to do your homework in order to get your parents to help you. And this is, really, as you're wanting to, get your parents help, it's really trying to provoke that parent's sense of nurturance towards the child. And then what happens is that this results in the parent sometimes doing homework for their child. And supplication doesn't mean that you're always pretending to have inadequacies. So you may actually have inadequacies, and then what you do is you emphasize the actual ones that you have. So I think, for example, very sadly, of someone who is seriously financially struggling and they're asking for money. So I live near ETSU, and I will frequently see people at the corner of Greenwood Drive, and as you exit Kroger, there's often someone there, different people who are asking for money. And it's, because of whatever their, different life circumstances. And on the sign that they have, they may be stating why they're asking for money. They're wanting others to know about their actual experience. And of course, we've heard about people who may not really be living those experiences. And I'm sure there are people who, and we all know that there are people who may not be being honest about that, and that is still supplication. But many of the people are really struggling, and there are many homeless people in our area. So this is a true experience, a real, true a truth of being down and out in life. And so an example of supplication. And then finally, we have negative acknowledgement. And this is where you admit your flaws, where you're saying, hey, I'm really not so good at this. I'm not great at this particular thing. And when you do this, it can help you to appear, especially if you do tend to be really good at what, maybe you're good at something the other person's noticed, and you feel like you want to connect more with them, and so you might admit your flaws so that you're really showing that vulnerability, and it might make you feel or seem more, you might seem more liked to that person. They might like you more because of it. And then sometimes people may be more inclined to help you as you admit the flaws that you have. As we think about presentation or how we present ourselves, a lot of this has to do with our ability to monitor our own behavior and how we come across. And so there's an important term that you should know, and that's called self-monitoring. And this is a personality trait that captures the differences in the extent to which people control the image that they present to others in social situations. Some of you may be high in self-monitoring. Some of you may be low in self-monitoring. High self-monitors are motivated and skilled at altering their behavior to influence the impressions that other people have on them, whereas low self-monitors tend to focus on remaining true to their inner attitudes by presenting a relatively consistent image of themselves to other people, regardless of the situation. So why is the understanding of self-monitoring important? Well, it's important if we want to understand how people and how we behave in social situations. And self-monitoring can influence people in many ways. It can affect how we behave over time, how we express our attitudes, how we perceive social cues and the behavior of others, how we approach interpersonal relationships, how we behave non-verbally. These are just a few of the ways that self-monitoring can have an effect on our behavior. And so high self-monitors, they tend to be less consistent in how they behave across different situations than low self-monitors do. And so they have a relatively weaker correspondence between their attitudes and their behaviors. And high self-monitors tend to tailor the attitudes that they express in correspondence with the people that are around them, with the audience. And what they're doing is they're really having an appreciation for the effect of the social context on the behavior of other people. And self-monitoring also has an effect on the types of situations that we might select for ourselves. And so people who are high in self-monitoring, and some of you may be this way, where you're very good at or concerned with making a favorable impression to other people and interpreting or having an effect on what people interpret from you when they interact with you. And so people who are high in self-monitoring like this, they tend to want to engage in situations where there is a clear definition of what is expected. And this then will help them to adapt their behaviors. Whereas low self-monitors, they're fine with being in any situation pretty much. And they also, they're more inclined to select situations that are converging with their own dispositions. They're not concerned with needing those very specifically, very clearly structured expectations that are understood. And then in interpersonal relationships, people who are high in self-monitoring, the people that they tend to hang out with, they tend to have different friends in different situations. And then whereas low self-monitors tend to have a stable group of friends who are similar to them in a global way. And high self-monitors, in terms of nonverbal cues, they're better able to convey internal states and then to conceal socially inappropriate emotional displays than people who are low in self-monitoring. So people who are actually high in self-monitoring, some of the research suggests that they're more inclined to non-consciously mimic nonverbal behavior. So they might, cross their arms as another person does, or even shake their foot as another person does. And what's very interesting, and many of you may know this, is that mimicry, and not in a weird way where you're imitating and copying intentionally what anyone's doing, but kind of subtly mimicking what someone else is doing it's actually used non-consciously to achieve social connection.
So overall, we can think about the importance of building self-esteem. We know that people with low self-esteem are more prone to depression. They're more demoralized by failure. So people with low self-esteem might be more inclined then to avoid situations where there might be failure, which means they're taking less risks and
Your textbook does a great job of providing you with some information and guidance for increasing self-esteem. And one is recognizing that you control your self-image. And so you can change your self-image to a more positive one. So think about the concepts that you've learned so far in this chapter and how you can use those to have a positive effect on how you see yourself and how others see you and interact with you. Of course, we want to maintain truth to who we are, and there is that very fine balance. Also, learning more about yourself. People with low self-esteem don't tend to know as much about themselves. So spending time to understand your interests and understand your values, those behaviors are connected to learning more about yourself, which is connected to increasing self-esteem. Taking charge of setting your own goals. Now, this is related to individualistic cultures. This is culturally relative. When we think about collectivism, remember that's where you have more concern for group goals, community goals, family goals. In our individualistic culture, we emphasize the value of individual goals. And so setting our own goals in our own individualistic culture, that's going to be helpful in promoting self-esteem. And then recognizing unrealistic goals. So we all want to feel as though we're accomplishing our goals. So we want to make sure that we know what are our goals that we are setting and are they achievable? At least are they achievable within a relatively, a period of time that is reasonable. And if they're not, if they're a long way out, have some intermediate goals so that we can have some sense of accomplishment along the way. And then remember, using that optimistic explanatory style as we think about the role of internal and external attributions. And as we think about optimism, we also want to think about recognizing that our failures are not due to stable factors, and our successes, yes, they can be due to stable factors about ourselves. And so, is it that we're not being honest with ourselves if we're optimistic? No, we want to be real with ourselves. But sometimes when we're pessimistic, we're also not being real. So we really need to be challenging our thoughts, recognizing that some of the things we are thinking may not be in line with what's actually going on. And we want to move into more of that optimistic explanatory style. And then thinking about your strengths, remind yourself each day as on your way to school, if you're feeling like, hey, I'm struggling in this, maybe you're taking a chemistry class and you feel like you're struggling, remind yourself of your strengths. You're a hard worker. You're very committed to school. You're really good at art, or you're really good at reading people. So remind yourself of those strengths and then cultivate a new strength. Remember that self-efficacy is very important. Find opportunities to build new skills and then approach others with a positive outlook. When we do this, this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When we have a positive outlook, this affects how people interact with us, which then provides us with very different feedback than we would be getting if we had a negative outlook, which then would result in some perhaps negative responses from others. So I'd encourage you to take a look at this section in your book. They have some great guidance that relates directly back to what you've learned in this module. And here's an image from your textbook that shows the vicious circle of low self-esteem and rejection. And so a negative self-image, as you see here, can affect what we expect to happen. And then, like I mentioned, this can then become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we have an expectation that negative things are going to happen, then negative things may, not because we're, putting bad energy out into the world, in this sort of like, this sense that is non-tangible. It's that we really are affecting how people then interact with us and what happens to us. And so if we change our outlook, if we begin to, and sometimes it begins with changing our thinking before we even change our behaviors. And so if we can change that thinking, challenge it, that can be very helpful. Sometimes it can involve we could change our behaviors first. So maybe we go to class and we think people don't really want to hang out with me. They don't think I'm very likable. It might be hard to change those thoughts. But what about challenging yourself to change your behavior? What if the next time you go to class, you decide that you're going to talk with the person sitting next to you and you're going to ask them something about what they did over the weekend, or about something that you've noticed that maybe in class they've asked some questions that are maybe related to something you're also interested in. And so it may not be in line with your thoughts to want to talk with that person. You may have that doubt in your mind about yourself, but as you talk with them, you come up with this new behavior, then you're going to have a different response, which then can help to challenge those thoughts. So we can change that vicious cycle. We can interrupt it. All right, I've got several opportunities for you to test yourself. And as I ask you these questions, if you're unsure of the answer, I'd encourage you to go back in your notes, go back in your book, and take some extra time to review those concepts. So let's get started. What you believe to be true about yourself is called your what. What is this called? And by the way, some of these questions will be coming directly from your book. I covered the majority of things that are in your book, but I do want to be sure that you are reading, so make sure that you're reading those chapters and taking notes as you are. So what is this called? This is called our self-schema. If you didn't know the answer to that, make sure that you take a look at that. We can connect this to our self-concept. What we think is true about ourselves. Here's the next one. If you've ever felt anxious because you knew that you should have visited family rather than going out with friends, there's an explanation for this conflict. According to self-discrepancy literature, you've experienced a disconnect between your actual self and your what self. Let's take a look at the answer. If you selected ought, you're correct. That ought self is telling us what we should be doing. And when we're not doing what we should be doing, it causes anxiety. Remember, this then can cause us to engage in behaviors where we can blunt those feelings. Sometimes it can cause us to engage in unhealthy behaviors, even like drinking or drug use if we experience anxiety because of that discrepancy. All right, so let's try this one. When people make internal attributions about the behavior of others or themselves, they attribute their behavior to what factors? Is it situational, personal, interpersonal, or environmental? So which is it? If you're not sure, again, go back and take a look at your notes or at your book. If you chose personal, you're right. Remember, we had that chart where we looked at the personal factors that we identify or that we may use to explain our behavior or the behavior of others. These could include things like age, gender, personality traits, etc. So go back and take a look at that if you're not sure about this concept. Let's look at another one. Illusions of control and the better than average effect, and this is from your book, make sure you're reading. What is the better than average effect? Is this an example of self-enhancement, self-improvement, self-assessment, or self-delusion? If you don't know what this is, make sure you go back and take a look at your textbook. I will just go ahead and share with you though, in general, the better than average effect is our tendency to see ourselves as better than average. Most people, when asked about most things related to their qualities and their behaviors, they do tend to see themselves as better than average. And which of these is this? What is this? Self-enhancement, self-improvement, self-assessment, or self-delusion? What's the term we use? It is self-enhancement. So make sure you take a look at that concept in your book. Here's another one. Research has shown that self-efficacy is related to all except which of the following? So which of these do you think it is not related to? Do you think that what is self-efficacy? Remember, this is our ability to feel like we can successfully engage in behaviors. So self-efficacy is related to career choice. So we're more likely to choose careers that perhaps could be associated with challenging goals, where we may have some extra responsibilities. It's also connected to academic success. It can become a self-fulfilling prophecy and to job performance, but not so connected to marital satisfaction. Here's another one. Blank are seemingly intentional actions that thwart a person's self-interest. Are these self-efficacies, self-defeating behaviors, vicarious experiences, or emotional arousal? And we just recently talked about these, so which are these? If you're not sure, go back and take a look in your textbook. If you selected self-defeating behaviors, you're correct. We went over several different examples of self-defeating behaviors. Some of those may be pretty benign. Some can be pretty serious, like abusing drugs and alcohol. Here's another one. A woman who describes herself as frank and honest but actually lies is manifesting frequently her what? Self-concept, self-conflict, self-discrepancy, or self-ambivalence. So which is this? If you selected self-discrepancy, which can cause a lot of anxiety and also can cause depression depending upon what the discrepancy is between. Is it between our ought self and our actual self? Is it between our ideal self and our actual self? Either way, this is a discrepancy, and it leads to different behaviors that may cause us to feel better or may allow us to avoid the situation. Here's another one. Tanisha earned a C on her psychology paper. She began to reassure herself that at least she did not get a D like Barry. What is this an example of? Is this self-serving bias? Is it downward comparison? Is it self-handicapping? Is it reflected glory? Let me take a moment to say, make sure you know each of these concepts. So you should be able to identify among these which one we're talking about. This is an example of downward comparison. And so she's looking at someone who's done worse than her. This is not a great way for us to improve. If we want to improve ourselves, we need to look to people who are doing better than us. If we are surrounding ourselves with people who are not doing better, then we're going to remain pretty stagnant. If we want to grow, be better, surround ourselves with people who are doing better in whatever it is that we want to excel at. But this does make us feel better, at least temporarily. Here's one more. Unlike the vast majority of her coworkers who indulged in a delicious cheesecake, Sharon resisted the temptation to overeat at the departmental luncheon. After the luncheon, employees are assigned to groups to discuss and report back on some strategic planning tasks. The likelihood that Sharon would give up more quickly in her group than her coworkers is consistent with what? The ego depletion model of self-regulation, the ego integrity model of self-efficacy, the unstable self-control model, or the poor self-control model. Only one of these is an actual phrase or concept, and that is the what? Ego depletion model of self-regulation. Remember, once we've had to exercise a lot of self-control, it becomes harder for us to continue to do this, and we're more likely to give in. We're more likely to give up that sense of self-control. So we give into whatever it is that we might ordinarily not want to be doing. Remember how important self-regulation is. Be sure to read about that. Go back in your notes and make sure that you have a good description of that, and think about how you can improve your own self-regulation and the things that it does affect. That concludes our module on the self. You have learned a lot about the self, many important concepts that I hope have helped you to think about all the things we do to try and maintain a consistent view of ourselves. And I hope that that this chapter or module has helped you to understand the different behaviors we might engage in to affect how people perceive us. Also, I hope that you have a good sense of the value of having a healthy self-esteem and those factors that contribute to its development. Make sure that you are looking at your student learning guide, and make sure that as you have read the chapter or as you have watched this video, if any questions come up, to please let me know. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing each of you online.